So thank you to everybody for joining us today for the FBO MNP Automation in the Ontario Food and Beverage Processing Sector webinar. Thank you for joining us and for taking the time. Before we get into it, I just wanted to first of all thank all of our members and who participated in our automation surveys, our interviews. The feedback was fantastic, and we really appreciate that from everybody. So thank you for that. The two reports you're going to see today, I am going to share the links with everybody through email. So you'll see what Maria is going to present. Thank you as well to OMAFRA and the Canadian Agricultural Partnership for their support for these two studies, because without them, we wouldn't have been able to do them. So again, thank you for that. Thank you to Maria as well, Maria Gonzalez, who headed up these surveys for us. She did a fantastic job, and you're going to see that today. This is the first in a series of events we'll be doing around the automation space. We see automation and technology in our sector as being one of those relief points for labor and competitiveness. So this is the first in a series. Hopefully in 2022, we'll be coming out with some in-person events. And I've got my fingers crossed as I'm saying that, because we know how fast things can change. But again, we see this as being a big focus for us over the next year. We are looking to continue the work we've built here on these two reports with some other work that we're hoping to do for the sector around automation. We've got a couple of ideas percolating, and we hope to share some more information in January on those. But again, be on the lookout for some more events from us. So with that, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If Maria, if you can pull up that slide. So we just ask you to mute during the presentation. Towards the end of the session, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. If you have any questions, please use the chat for questions. And again, towards the end of the session, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. So the process, or the agenda, is going to be, Maria is going to present the reports for us. We'll have the panel discussion, and following the panel discussion, we will have Q&A, and Sean Crew from MNP will lead us through the panel discussion. So with that, I'd like to pass it on to Glenn Fraser.
Thanks, Jason. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm really excited to be part of this webinar today. My name is Glenn Fraser, and I'm the national leader of MNP's Food and Beverage Processing Practice. And so for those of you that don't know MNP, we're a leading national accounting, tax, and business consulting firm in Canada. We're a firm rooted in its history in agriculture, and we understand the needs of our clients from the farm gate to the consumer plate. As a firm, we service over 1,000 food and beverage clients, offering a diverse suite of solutions to the unique needs of our clients. We have a dedicated team of professionals, some of them you'll meet today, who help a broad spectrum of food and beverage processing organizations navigate the complexities of the industry in a strategic and pragmatic way. The food and beverage processing landscape is rapidly evolving, and we saw the need to be agile and adaptive, especially in light of the recent pandemic. With labor shortages and workforce safety concerns at the forefront, it's become increasingly important to address solutions to these issues that face many food and beverage processing organizations. I'm really excited to introduce my colleague, Maria Gonzalez. Maria is a senior manager at MNP and leads our consulting efforts in food and beverage. Drawing on more than a decade of consulting experience, Maria has carried out a wide range of studies on important topics for the Canadian food and beverage sector, including labor, supply chain, and automation. More recently, in collaboration with Jason Crawford at FBO, Maria and her team carried out 2 studies on the topic of automation for the Ontario food and beverage sector. The first study identified the barriers and drivers to automation for Ontario food and beverage processors, while the second study was focused on the development of a technology implementation guide for Ontario food and beverage to support their automation journey. Both studies were supported and funded by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, affectionately known as OMAFRA to all of us. Maria holds a master's in food and resource economics from the University of British Columbia, a master's of business administration from Cornell University and Queen's University. It's my pleasure to introduce Maria, who will walk us through the importance of automation in the food and beverage sector and how you can integrate sustainable strategies into your organization today for long-term success.
Thank you so much, Glenn, for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here with you, really to give you an insight into some of the key findings of the 2 studies that we carried out in collaboration with Food and Beverage Ontario. I'll start off by just providing you with a quick introduction to these studies. Glenn already alluded to sort of the focus of the study. So just at a high level, we'll present to you what the sort of nature of the studies was and how we actually carried out the projects. So the first study really tried to get a sense of what are the barriers to automation in the sector, what led companies to adopt new technologies. In other words, what are the drivers? The study also documented the types of sort of training required and types of costs that are required for the adoption of new technology, and then also uncovered what are the supports or resources required that would help increase the adoption of technology and robotics technology in food processing operations in Ontario. The first study really was carried out through a series of research activities. It was informed by a survey of 37 food and beverage companies, some of which are in this webinar. So thank you so much for participating. And also a series of focus groups, 3 with food and beverage on processors in Ontario and 1 with subject matter experts in the topic of automation. And really building on the findings from the first study, then we moved into the development of a technology implementation how-to guide for the Ontario food and beverage sector. And the guide provides information to help companies through their journeys of technology implementation. For example, it provides an overview of the benefits and challenges of technology implementation, key considerations and best practices when you're thinking about adopting new technology. It also includes a list of resources and contexts that could be accessed by you to help with your technology implementation journey. The guide also features case studies of companies that have been successful in adopting technology and talks about sort of the challenges and opportunities that they faced along the way. As Glenn mentioned, these both studies were supported and funded by OMAFRA. I know some of the representatives from the OMAFRA team are here. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and delighted to present some of the key findings with you today. I'll start off with the key highlights of the findings from the first automation study, starting off with financial barriers. Food and beverage companies that completed the survey for the study were asked to rate a number of financial barriers on the extent to which they saw them being barriers in the way of adoption of automation and robotics technology for their food and beverage processing operations, particularly in Ontario. The ratings were from minor barrier to major barrier to not applicable. And as shown on this slide, there were 7 financial barriers that survey respondents were asked to rate. The graph on this slide really lists the financial factors from greatest to least in terms of the number of respondents that rated them. And as shown on the graph, we just highlighted the top 4 financial barriers or factors that were considered the most substantial when they're thinking about adopting new technology or automation. First one being cost of external automation and robotics maintenance services, in other words, contracted expertise. The second barrier there is cost of operational delays of implementation. Third, lack of access to capital, in other words, funding. And fourth, cost of hiring and training of internal employees for automation of robotics maintenance. During our focus groups with food and beverage companies that participated in the survey, we had the opportunity to really probe further into each of these findings. But just for the purposes of this presentation, we'll just cover the survey highlights. But as Jason mentioned, the links to the full reports will be shared with you, and you can sort of look into the additional context behind some of these findings. Now I'll move into reporting on the sort of findings on the operational barriers to automation for food and beverage companies. Similar to the last slide, food and beverage companies were asked the same question, but now related to operational barriers, to rate each of the given operational barriers to the extent that they get in the way of them adopting automation or technology. And as shown on the graph on this slide, the 3 operations related barriers that were considered the most substantial were first, lack of availability of skilled labor to operate the automation and robotics equipment / infrastructure. So not just, lack of availability of labor to work on their operations, but in this case, lack of skilled labor to operate the equipment or technology being implemented. The second operational barrier was lack of availability of external automation and robotics installation and maintenance services. In other words, contracted expertise, which was also noted as a financial barrier, but on the cost side. The third operational barrier there, most substantial, was the lack of availability of appropriate automation and robotics equipment / infrastructure, which is quite interesting finding for our study. And for those that actually selected that third operational barrier, the lack of availability of appropriate automation and robotics equipment and infrastructure, they were asked a follow-up question, which allowed us to really get into sort of the root cause of this. The follow-up question asked survey companies to describe the source of the issue of the lack of availability of appropriate automation and robotics equipment infrastructure. And as shown on the graph on this slide, approximately 78% of survey respondents pointed to the lack of equipment and infrastructure that is manufactured domestically in Ontario as a primary source. You have to note that the survey was conducted in the middle of the pandemic, when at the time, certain borders were closed. It was really difficult for them to bring in equipment from overseas, and really that issue of not being able to access the required equipment or infrastructure within Ontario was a big issue. Processors that participated in the focus groups validated these survey findings and provided insights on the availability or lack thereof of equipment manufactured in Ontario. We also asked a series of questions around areas of support that could help lessen some of these barriers to automation in this sector. Specifically, survey respondents were asked to indicate which types of support would be of most value when it comes to supporting the adoption of automation and robotics technology in their operations. And as shown on the graph on this slide, the top 2 selected types of support was first, grants for capital purchases or investments in technology, and second one, employee training support. Focus group participants were asked a series of follow-up questions related to the grants for capital purchases. And in responding to these questions, food and beverage companies commented that, a major criteria for many of the government funding programs that they had seen in the past, they had the requirement of job creation. And a lot of these companies that were looking to automate was because, one, they didn't have the employees to work on their facilities, but they were also looking to implement the technology to become less labor intensive. So really that criteria was not necessarily applicable. Also, some processors commented that although they applied for funding support for the purchase of new technology to automate facilities, they could not get support because their technology was not considered innovative or novel enough. Processors also shared that more funding is needed on a pre-project basis. But certainly, we saw provincial governments, particularly OMAFRA, come up with some really great funding programs after the release of this study, which really address some of these key issues identified by processors during our study. And really, based on the findings from the study, we identified a set of 3 key recommendations for increasing the adoption of automation and robotics in the sector. First one, really around that government support funding, really broadening the scope and flexibility of funding programs for the adoption of automation and robotics technology in the sector. For example, ensuring that funding for the adoption of automation is not job tied to job creation, that they really extend extend the scope of eligible activities for funding to include activities such as employee training support and IT infrastructure reconfiguration. The second recommendation identified was to facilitate increased collaboration between the sector and post-secondary institutions to identify ways to address gaps in skilled labor and training related to the topic of automation. According to our consultations with processors and subject matter experts on the topic of automation, lack of skilled labor to operate the automation robotics equipment was one of the most substantial barriers to adoption, and thus collaboration between the sector and post-secondary institutions was raised by processors as an opportunity to expand upskilling, training, and recruitment of skilled labor. The third recommendation there was to support and build capacity for Ontario-made equipment manufacturing and technology solutions for the sector. This is a large undertaking. However, this can be done through fostering collaboration between the sector stakeholders, Ontario equipment suppliers, and academic institutions, along with government and other research and commercialization partners, all toward bettering the establishment and growth of the Ontario-made equipment for the sector. There's been some examples where this has taken place, but certainly processors noted there's further opportunity to do more on this particular area. Now, as mentioned, building on the prior study, we then developed the technology implementation guide. We'll just share a quick snapshot of some information contained in the guide. It includes a lot of information, and we really encourage you to look at the guide in detail, as there may be some good information for you as you're thinking about potentially adopting new technology in your facilities. The technology implementation guide contains a detailed checklist for those that are thinking about implementing technology, just a checklist of things that you ought to think about before you go ahead and procure a piece of equipment or technology for your facilities. At a high level, it is important for those considering implementing technology to ask questions that enable you to see if the technology really aligns with your business, your current state, situation, and goals. For example, asking, will implementing the new technology really help you address the current challenges faced by your company? Is your management team, ready and willing and prepared to dedicate significant amount of time and resources to the implementation and change management efforts that are required? Is your company, from the floor workers to the executive team, prepared to transition to new processes? Is your selected technology vendor also a good fit for your company? So just an example of questions that you ought to think about. In terms of budgeting and planning, it is important to ask questions such as, have you accurately determined the infrastructure upgrade and new equipment costs? Through our consultations, we learned that there's a lot of hidden costs when it comes to implementing new technology that processors sometimes don't think about. The change management aspect, the training piece for both new employees that you have to hire to actually be able to work with that technology, as well as the existing staff on the floor. In terms of technology knowledge and skills, it is important to ask questions such as, has the project leadership team led successful technology implementation projects in the past? And if so, what can be sort of leveraged and learned from those experiences? Does your company have the technology implementation plan in place? And if no, can it gain access to formal technology implementation planning support from outsiders? In terms of the team that will likely support you in the execution of your technology implementation journey project, it is important to ask questions in advance, such as, have you prepared a project plan, including accountability of team members, how frequent you're going to have meetings to talk to your team about milestones and completion dates. Through these two studies, we actually learned also that training is often overlooked when it comes to technology implementation, and it is critical for the success of these types of projects. So important questions you want to ask prior to adopting new technology include, does your company have a plan to manage the short-term training of existing staff to adopt the new technology, as well as the long-term onboarding of new staff and the ongoing upskilling of current staff? The guide presents to you information that just helps you understand the various aspects of a technology implementation project that you need to think through before you actually move ahead with a project. And as mentioned earlier, the technology implementation guide includes case studies of 3 companies, Bonduel, Maple Leaf, and Belmont Meats, that have gone through the implementation of technology recently. And we capture through these case studies, their journeys, their successes, their challenges along the way. And also representatives that we spoke to shared lessons learned from the implementation of these technologies, as well as words of wisdom that they wanted to share to other food and beverage companies that are looking to procure and potentially implement new technologies. For the purpose of this presentation, I'll just go over one of those case studies featuring Bonduel, America's Long Life. Bonduel has recently gone through the implementation of a robotic palletizing system, and this was just during or prior, probably at the beginning of COVID. And really the premise behind the implementation of this technology for them was significant challenges in attracting and retaining labor to support their processing operations. Further, the manual intensive tasks around their palletizing area were a deterrent for new employees and a challenge as well for the current production staff. So in response to those challenges, Bonduel said, let's move ahead and implement a major robotic palletizing system. And really this machine allowed them to automate the sorting, the transferring, the stocking of goods and products onto their palletizing onto a pallet. And really the system replaced all the labor-intensive manual forklift operations, reduced the reliance on workers, and accordingly minimized the frequency of accidents and injuries on site as well. The operations manager on Bonduel spoke to some of the challenges that they face in implementing this piece of technology. They were faced with the tough decision to shut down its facility for a month or having to push the technology implementation further just to ensure a successful implementation of that piece of technology. Bonduel at the end of the day chose to shut down the plant, which allowed for a more concrete adoption of the technology combined with a sort of redistribution of supplies across its network and potentially some long-term cost savings from avoided equipment failure. Bonduel recommended, when talking about what would you say to others that are thinking about implementing a new technology, what are your words of wisdom? They shared, take a long-term approach when implementing new technology, as there can be upfront costs and temporary disruption in your production processes. But at the end of the day, the operations manager said, technologies will make your systems more efficient and safer, and you'll earn more dividends in the long term, but it's a long-term play. And also a very important piece shared by a lot of the technology companies that participated in this study said, not just go and buy this technology off the shelf just because you think it's ready. How does that technology piece fit with your long-term goals, and how does it fit with the rest of the sort of equipment technology you have in place and the systems behind supporting these pieces of equipment? The second recommendation there was consider support that you can trust. For Bonduel, it was critical for them to go with a supplier that they had used before and that they had already a good relationship with, so that they can sort of trust the longevity of the investment, because it's never just a one-time project. Usually there's in the next 3 years, you'll have to update a certain piece of that technology. You want to be able to work with that same vendor. They also mentioned that they have multiple facilities, so they use the same pallet packing system across all their facilities, reducing the amount of inventory of critical parts required. For them, a critical piece to the success of this project was frequent and transparent communication with staff as to, the benefits of this new technology. Yes, the people that were working in the palletizing area had to be moved into other areas, but at the same time, this equipment reduced the manual intensive tasks that they were there for, and just allow them to be, perhaps more engaged with the other areas of the operation. Really for them, they said, getting employee buy-in is critical right at the beginning when implementing technologies. And last sort of word of wisdom there, foster a continuous improvement mindset regardless of the site the size of your company. So always focus on how to improve your operations by doing research and getting frequent feedback from your frontline employees. I'll just conclude the presentation of this case study with the quote from the operations manager at Bonduel. Suffer through short-term pain to gain in the long term. We had to shut down for a month, which was hard. And he mentioned not something that any food company of smaller size would be able to do, but for them, in the long term, it gave them a more engaged employees and better operations. So with that, I will conclude sort of the findings, the presentation of the key findings of the two studies, and I'll pass the mic over to Sean Crew from MMP to really help us kick off an exciting panel discussion on the topic of technology implementation, and hopefully we can address some of the key findings from these two studies.
Perfect. Thank you, Maria, for the overview of the two studies. Very informative. And of course, given time constraints, we've only gone through kind of at a high level. We would encourage everyone to take a full read of the studies. A lot of great information in there for everybody. We are going to move on to the next agenda item here. It's going to be a roundtable discussion relating to the studies. What we want to try to do here is elaborate on some of the findings in the report and get an understanding of some of the practical matters that companies are facing with bringing innovation and technology into their businesses. My name is Sean Crew, and I'm a partner here at M&P, based out of our Mississauga office. And I'm also the food and beverage processing lead for Ontario at M&P, and I support Glenn in his national role. I'm going to be moderating the discussion today, and I'm very happy to get the opportunity as well to introduce our panel members. On behalf of M&P and FBO, I would like to welcome Doug Alexander, Jason Helsley, and again, Maria Gonzalez. So our first panelist, Doug Alexander, joined Premium Brands Holdings as Vice President and General Manager, led Better Foods, and most recently accepted the role of Vice President Technical Services, Belmont Food Group, a division of Premium Brands Holdings. Belmont Food Group is a Canadian food company consisting of 60 leading specialty food manufacturing and differentiated food distribution businesses with operations across North America. Doug has 34 years of experience in food processing operations in various segments, including bakery, pasta sauces, vegetable processing, and meat processing. Outside of Belmont, Doug currently serves as a director on the Agricultural Adaptation Council Board, Food and Beverage Ontario Board, and the Meat and Poultry Ontario Board. Doug has also served as chair of the Agri-Food Management Institute, chair of Food Starter, and the board of directors of Provision Coalition. Welcome, Doug. Our next panelist is Jason Helsley. Jason is a principal at GHD and is business group lead for food and agribusiness. GHD is a global professional services company that leads through engineering, construction, and architectural expertise. Their forward-looking, innovative approaches connect and sustain communities around the world. Jason has 23 years of expertise leading high-caliber, cross-functional teams in all aspects of food and beverage manufacturing. He focuses on assessing the complex needs of a client's business and driving sustainable solutions in challenging business environments. He is a results-driven professional collaborating with multinational teams to bring innovative solutions to the forefront. So welcome, Jason. And our third panelist, who doesn't need further introduction, Maria Gonzalez, one of the key authors of the study from M&P, whom Glenn introduced earlier, will also be joining. Welcome, Maria. So I'm going to kick off the discussion with a question, and I guess it's probably open to any one of the three of our panelists to get things going. In your view, what were key findings of the study that you were surprised to see bubble up and be more pervasive issues in the sector than you might have thought? Were you surprised by any of the outcomes of the study, and why? Doug, I know you're pretty good at getting things kicked off. Maybe we can pick on you.
Yeah, thanks. And this is a really important event, I guess, would be and timely. Less important because the biggest crisis we face right now is around labor, and it's a global problem, and it's really shifted the challenges we have. So this is really important. I actually skipped Santa Claus to make sure I attended this because he came to our plant here in Aurelian I could see him out the window. But anyway, this is way more important than Santa. And boy, I really miss doing these things in person, so I could see all the folks out there that I know. So what surprised me the most, other than the length of my bio, which I got to shorten somewhat, is how well people understood the challenge. The really largest challenge we have, aside from skilled trades, is really the availability and access to automation and technology and support for it. We don't have the infrastructure really here in Canada that we may have had at one point, and it's degraded seriously over the last 25, 30 years to where it's so difficult to do automation, exacerbated by the pandemic. Having local automation technology evolve towards the food industry as opposed to where it currently is focused would be enormously helpful.
Perfect. Jason, maybe you can add to that.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. One thing we're seeing is automation is no longer a nice to have as it has been in the past. It's now a must have, and Doug just touched on many of the aspects that are driving it. Before you were looking at the ROI and it was quite costly. Now that it's a must have, and those decisions, the decision tree has changed lately. ROI is still obviously a consideration, but certainly there are many other factors that have bubbled to the surface, as you mentioned in the study. So that was very evident.
Yeah, so maybe I can take what you guys have shared here, and I think reading through the studies and in particular, the technology implementation guide. Clearly, many companies want to understand what best practices are out there that food and beverage processors can make use of when adopting new automation and robotics technology, particularly in the small and mid-sized market. Realizing that this is a very broad topic, and obviously there's a great technology implementation guide that provides a pretty thorough framework for innovation and how to drive that forward in a company. One of the major steps in that process is overcoming barriers, and I think Maria, you took us through a number of different types of barriers that the study uncovered, but more from a practical perspective here, Doug and Jason, given the backgrounds that you guys come from, obviously Doug being right in the neck of it, right in the heat of it in an organization, and Jason as a service provider. From a practical perspective here, what are some of the barriers that you or companies that you have worked with have had to overcome, and how did you successfully approach dealing with and overcoming those barriers to implementing innovation? And either Doug or Jason, you guys can maybe jump in.
Well, after last week, it was tough to shut me up, but I'll go anyway. Sorry, Jason. The biggest challenge that we have, other than the access to skilled trades, which is given, and it's been exacerbated with the global shortage of labor, which is really the largest crisis we all face right now. More importantly, is simple support for it. In other words, you don't have to fly somebody in from another country and the time delays for that. We run our business 16 hours a day, 6 days a week quite often. Some businesses in the food industry run 24/7. And you can't really afford to wait for somebody to be able to book a flight and come over. So something more regional in the way of support and the way of construction would make a huge difference in things. So we overcame that by, I would say, influencing other companies to start to find local OEM support networks. So in the past, I looked at some equipment out of Italy, and I convinced a Burlington company to become their support mechanism locally. So I could get support 8 minutes away in that facility rather than wait for somebody to hop a plane from Italy. And so some of the things I've done is develop collaborations between perhaps distributors or equipment support companies that are local that don't necessarily represent companies internationally. I'll use a metal detector company as a good example. They once had a support mechanism in Oakville. They shifted it to Chicago. We felt it everywhere in Canada on support. And so it's not a complex piece of equipment, but because it was Chicago instead of in Ontario, it became a real problem. It pretty quickly came back to Ontario as they lost business. So I think it really is something that really needs to, you have to be very creative in creating those collaborations to make sure that you look after your own support locally.
Right.
Great points, Doug. I can add a little bit to that. Certainly, the local support is key, and as touched on in the study, the digital roadmap, if you will, digital automation roadmap. So you're doing the pre-planning. You can't stress enough the pre-planning that's needed in order to successfully implement. We've been called in partway through a project where pieces of equipment that they've shipped in from across overseas or elsewhere won't actually fit in the building. So they're having to increase roof sizes, open doors up. You talk about additional costs and delays. If you've got a facility shut down and now all of a sudden you're ripping walls and raising ceilings, the opportunity cost there is significant. The opportunity lost there is significant. So certainly having a roadmap to avoid or minimize those disruptions. I would even challenge that, you could do things without having to shut down a facility, provided that the roadmap is sufficient, that you've done all that front end work, so that when it comes time for the shiny new piece of equipment to be dropped in, you're ready to go. Whether you've twinned it, digital twinning or other things that you can do to monitor these disruptions, certainly would add significant value on the back end.
Great. And so Maria, both Doug and Jason here have sort of touched on, I guess, the idea here of, the barrier that, not having things as maybe as readily available or made in Ontario as they may previously have been, through the pandemic in particular, that becoming a lot more, let's say, front of house here as an opportunity for ways to reduce barriers. Maria, maybe you can just comment on this, because I know that there's a lot in the study on this. What types of incentives are necessary to promote the development of infrastructure to domestically manufacture equipment in Ontario that will help reduce the barriers to implementing automation?
I think Doug alluded to what he's done in the past on, personally, to try to get those collaborations in place for him to be able to access support regionally. I think the recommendation there is to do it on a sort of a more of a sector view, in that, sector comes together and really focuses on creating those collaborations between existing equipment suppliers, because we had a number of technology providers that attended our focus groups that said, we're here and we're here to support you. However, there's no system in place where the sector, leaders of the sector can work with equipment manufacturers and suppliers to create that sort of avenue where they can talk and figure out a way to actually work better, given that it will take time for equipment manufacturers to start producing the equipment or pieces of technology the food manufacturers require, right? It will take time, but in the meantime, creating that sort of collaboration and a system where the collaboration can actually happen. Doug does it on an individual basis, but I think everyone spoke to perhaps doing it more on a sectoral basis to really try to hone is what it's existing in Ontario and leveraging what's existing into moving it into food and beverage manufacturing, with the support of government and post-secondary institutions as well.
Right. And so very much in line with the recommendations of the report. So, that was the next thing that I was just going to, building off of what you're talking about, Maria, just in terms of how can government support come into play in other ways to help support the adoption and implementation of automation and robotics in technology in the food and beverage processing sector?
I'll let Doug take this one.
So I think development of tooling. So automation works really well when you're working with uniform widgets, we'll call it, that are consistent in size and shape. And our industry is organic and irregular constantly. So the development of tooling specific, or businesses that can evolve tooling to adapt robotics to our industry, is very important. I can think of some examples around sliced meats that are shingled, and a dozen years ago, a local company developed a way to scoop it up and put it into a vacuum package fairly efficiently. Those are isolated, good examples of things, but we need more of that to be able to take perhaps foreign constructed robotics and adapt it to our industry and continue to adapt because everyone has a different application. So support from government to Mark, so to enable I was speaking to somebody in the audience, and it doesn't work here with this mechanism where I could just talk directly to people. But anyway, she knows who she is. So if they could talk to John Kelly about this, this is the usual subjects that he usually talks about. But anyway, if they can encourage or support the development or the evolution from, let's say, the auto sector or other sectors, a large appliance construction sector, to food and beverage to adapt tooling locally to us, it'll accelerate the process to where a Fuji robot built in Japan can be quickly adapted to, let's say, bacon packaging here in Aurelia. Not so easily done. So it's that supporting the evolution towards more support mechanisms that may not construct the robots, but build the mechanisms around it, like tooling to support it. I say that right?
That
Jason?
makes sense. And along with that,
Maria, please.
yeah, I think that was voiced by many food processors that participated in the various focus groups. And along with that is support on the training aspect of the people that would then come in to install or maintain that equipment. And that it's a critical piece that is missing right now. And I think along with supporting the evolution of the development of the tools or mechanisms around very big, large piece of equipment that at this point would have to be brought in, also supporting the training and skill development side of things, just to support that as well, to accelerate that.
Yeah, those are both great points. I would also add further to that, a lot of funding mechanisms are tied to job creation because these programs like to say we created X number of jobs. Quite simply, and Doug touched on this earlier, there are no jobs. You're not replacing jobs. You're allowing the funding to advance the industry, be more productive with the same number of people. The shortage of people that they have certainly has benefits to the entire province or the entire country. It's not about adding jobs necessarily. It's having the right jobs and taking those people that are currently doing that mundane task and having them more effective in decision-making skills that the computer doesn't have to do.
Right. No, that's interesting. And previously we've met guys and we've had discussions, around all of this. And although I don't want to, bring, labor shortages, not, the main focus of the discussion, obviously living in a, an emerging from post-COVID era, we hope, COVID has certainly, introduced a number of different challenges to the sector. And Doug, in particular, you talked about a number of different things that came up in the process of going through the study, and the surveys and everything like that. Just around, what were some of these factors that were impacting labor and therefore also impacting companies' abilities to adopt innovation without having people.
So the primary driver is mostly a lack of capacity and responding to it. So in order not to have a bunch of angry salesmen that can't go sell anything because you can't make it because you don't have the people, that's literally where things are. So many companies don't have enough. It heightens the urgency. So where your automation cycle might have been 6 months or 4 months, now it's longer because the demand is there. So you're 9 to 12 months on an order. There's a longer window to get it installed. The sales cycle isn't exactly lining up with that. So it's constraining our capacity. So we need to find a way to be able to, because I can't see in the future yet. So we need to find a way to make it so that it's easier and more nimble to be able to identify and implement automation than what we have traditionally in the past, and find a way to accelerate it. And anything Greg can do to help us, because he thought he was off the hook, but I'm calling him out on this anyway, with the provincial government or federal government, whichever way. Anyway, the help that they can do to support us to accelerate this will align better with the sales cycle. So when a retailer comes along and says, I need it in pink instead of blue, you have the ability to be able to adapt to that as quickly at the speed of retail, as opposed to the speed of construction of automation.
Right.
They're just not on the shelf waiting for me to order one as much as I'd like that.
Great. So guys, I'm going to pause the panel at this point. We did want to save some time for any questions that might be out there from participants. Now, I don't have complete view of who all of the participants are, but I would ask that if you do have any questions that we would like to ask the panel, if you could add them into the chat, that would be appreciated. Or raise hands.
We could just start calling them out, you know.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe
Reza, you usually have a question. Come on. I can see you out there.
See, Sean, Doug must have answered all the questions.
I'm not surprised. I mean, he typically does, but we've got a number of different participants here. Maybe anyone from Ezio or Glenn, anyone with questions that you might want to ask to get a conversation started with the group.
We're going to start singing if you don't start asking questions. Jason's eager to start singing.
Yeah.
Ezio, I see you've come off mute.
Yes, thank you, Sean. Well, it's not so much a question, and I certainly don't want to put our OMAFRA colleagues on the spot. We're obviously very happy about the recent $25 million announcement that Food and Beverage Ontario was involved with. Certainly a great starting point with regard to providing incentives for the sector to automate, to compete, et cetera. But I guess as we approach the next Canadian Agricultural Partnership Agreement, as well as the next provincial budget, is there scope? Is there opportunity to build on that $25 million funding envelope? Now, I know that our OMAFRA colleagues certainly don't have the answer to that right off the bat, but I guess I'm just, it's an open-ended question, I guess, for everybody as to whether or not the industry should advocate along those lines as we proceed down that path, or whether or not some of our OMAFRA colleagues would like to comment on that, and we won't hold them to any specifics, but perhaps get a feeling from them as to some of the directions that are taking place within OMAFRA at the moment.
Thanks for that, Ezio. I guess at this point we'll leave it as a thought, just a general comment for the group.
Well, Sean, just before you go on, let's subtract out the OMAFRA folks, but let me raise that with Doug, Jason, and Jason. Your thoughts with regard to the scope and opportunity of upping the game with respect to advocating for additional funding that provides incentives to innovate, automate, et cetera. As a lead up to the next provincial budget, as well as the next cap.
What a great question. And Ezio, you've heard me sing, so you'll do anything to avoid that. So I think if it's great to see the funding programs come out the way that they have, and it's really welcome to encourage companies to move forward. We've been reticent as an industry for decades towards automation, one, because of a fear that it won't work and we're too flexible and we need something less risky. So de-risking investments and encouragement to get started, because as an industry, we really sorely lack automation of the technology that is really out there. And I think encouraging more investment will de-risk it and remove a lot of the fears that are present in the in the CapEx plans that we submit every fall for the next year, and the reticence to, is it really going to work? Yeah, what's the risk reward factor? We would usually just do a straight line on labor, and it doesn't work like that anymore. And there's a lot of, as Jason will add, a lot of development as you're adapting technology. So anything that can be done to de-risk it would be very, very welcome.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jason.
Go ahead, Jay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the key things to helping de-risk that, and it was touched on earlier in the study, was the colleges and universities having that training element, to bring that cohort of tech-ready individuals into the business. It's the meat business or other food production business, and it's not seen as a glamorous Google or Facebook or any of these other tech companies, startups, but there's certainly great career progression opportunities for students and others into that space. So focusing on bringing that element to it, as well as the training for the businesses that are adopting this. I mean, let's face it, a lot of the executive right down to the shop floor also need a bit of training, and that's all part of that, not just the shiny piece of equipment that sits there at the end. And I say the shiny piece of equipment, but there's so many other facets to automate. RPA doing the swivel chair stuff in the back office. Doug, you probably comment to this. There's probably a shortage of staff on the back end as well that can be automated. So not just the shiny piece of equipment, but other facets of the business as well.
Yeah, Ezio, to your point about we're doing. I mean, we are constantly pushing the message to OMAFRA and to the Ministry of Labor, and I will say OMAFRA have been very receptive. And again, I think the recent announcement, the $25 million, is a good example of that. Minister Thompson, gets it. From our perspective, we are pushing that, but as well as Jason said, with the technology comes the need for jobs. And so, we put out, Careers Now is looking at that because, it's now a career where you can move not from necessarily being, a manual to you can advance your career. So the opportunities are greater. So, I think everybody's pushing on that side of it. So, and I'll let Doug jump in.
Yeah, Greg's asked a wonderful question in the chat, and I'm encouraging all of those folks, and I see Britta's hand up there, which is great. Hi, Britta. Yep. Continuous improvement process or studies, we did do with a private consultancy a fairly in-depth study of the processes here. There was recommendations, but it was so broad and general, we couldn't get to the specifics quick enough. And so there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in our industry. There's a lot of opportunity. And so I think, are these skill sets broadly available in the sector currently? No. That's why there's consultancy that help it. I think perhaps re-entry into the food industry with some perhaps more practical statistics, or maybe Six Sigma training within the food processor courses that are out there. I think there's some practical tools that can arm young people better for the analysis that's required to justify these things. It's an excellent question, because at the end of the day, we did a very large comprehensive study here, and out of it came some incredibly generic and vague recommendations. Yet if we had people on site other than myself who could really spend the time understanding and studying specifics, creating metrics specifically, it would help justify both yield, labor ROI, and some other soft savings that are hard to identify without the Six Sigma type studies, the lean and continuous improvement studies that really support automation. So I think perhaps a little bit more education in that area to prepare students for entry into the food industry would be very helpful. That's an excellent question.
Britta, maybe we can get you, if you can unmute yourself for your question. We'll take that as the last question before we wrap up.
Okay, thanks so much. And one of the things that that I took from Doug, your comments, was really that you talked about risk, and what I haven't really heard too much in terms of this, the moving forward to automation and things in the food industry, is mention of the food safety aspect of the risk. So let's not forget about just the risk of the cost of the equipment, and is it going to work, and is it going to improve our ROI, or is it going to address our labor issues, but also what risk are we going to end up adding to our businesses if we adopt technology that might be suited to the automotive industry, for lack of a better example, that that needs to be tweaked, but it can't just be tweaked without consideration of the bigger picture of what might that equipment, what might the equipment look like, or what issues might that equipment have if it's brought into a cold and wet environment, or another type of environment that needs to be dry cleaned, for lack of a better example, bakery or something like that. And where could there be places of harborage of debris, and that could then lead to contamination issues. So it's not simply this risk about, what people might think of in terms of automation, bringing automation. It's also considering the food safety factors associated with that.
Yeah, very good point, Brita.
Very good point. Oh, sorry, Doug, were you going to jump in there?
No, you go ahead. I'll wait. Well, you've been hogging the floor all day myself.
That's a very good point. At the outset in the digital / automation roadmap, the food safety has to be one of the paramount risk elements in the risk register. Anytime you're undertaking, an automation or any sort of facility expansion, a risk register will track those risks and have the mitigation elements in there. Certainly, it would involve, as you say, referring to some automation in automotive coming to food. You're going to have to lean on vendors certainly for a lot of that. But in a collaborative environment with your ops folks, your food safety folks, your consultants, coming up with a solution to that, and notching down those risk, the elements on the risk register for that project, certainly could address some of that in stages.
So, Jason, as Brita's listening to you right now, I can hear in her head she's screaming out the word food safety culture. So I think what you're talking about is around a food safety culture. And a couple of years ago, I had the pleasure of chatting with the folks at Fanuc, and they've developed a full washdown robot. And one of the biggest challenges, we use corrosive alkalis, and some of my personal experiences in implementing automation is things like just pneumatic tubes that would vent in and out air while we're running cleaning cycles in our plant with corrosive chemicals to remove proteins and buildups of fat and so on. That gets aspirated into possibly aluminum circuits. And so in a conversation with them around, how did you guard your equipment against that? Because maybe you can hit it with a high pressure hose, and maybe it's IP67 or 69 watertight and pressure washable and wash down and some of those important terms. Have you really got the fullest understanding of how protected you need to make this stuff? Because it's got to be washable. And that's very important around a food safety culture. And some of the things that we take into account when we're looking at automation is, can we clean it enough? And will it survive that?
Awesome. Great, Doug and Jason. Thanks for those responses. And just, overall, thank you, Maria, Doug, and Jason for participating in the panel. I'm going to wrap it up now, turn it over to Jason for some closing comments.
Thanks, Sean. Thank you for your help with the panel, and thanks to Doug and Jason. And it's always a pleasure to have Doug on a panel, because we know it's never going to be there's never going to be a lot of silence, which is awesome. Again, thank you to all the attendees. And again, we will be continuing this series in the new year. Some of the items that we've talked about today, some of the challenges FBO is looking at about how can we be a help in that area. So stay tuned for some more details. But again, thank you everybody for attending. And if you have any questions on the reports, as I say, I'll send out the links to those reports on our site. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And again, thank you all for joining.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Maria. And
Bye.
thanks, Glenn.